So it's time to pay the piper, is it? Apparently, you burned down the village market, slew half of the guards in town, stole liberally from the Merchants Guild, you punched a bard in the face at the tavern, and did all kinds of dissolute things that I really can't mention. I have no idea why you were thrown in prison. And yet here you are. Well, your sentence has been handed down. Of course you were found guilty. But perhaps in a fit of leniency you were spared the worst. A life of hard labor? No. Instead, you were being banished to the Lair of OmnusI.
You have failed me for the last time. Hi, I'm OmnusI. Welcome to the Lair of OmnusI. Round 2. Later.
Murderhobo. An ugly word with an ugly meaning for anyone who's into narrativist gameplay. Let's break the word apart, shall we? Murder. To kill in an illegal fashion. Of course, the authority reserves the right to kill people in legal fashions, but for everyone else it's illegal. It is seen as one of the worst actions that a person can do in civilized society, only coming close and being approximated by other illegal actions upon another person's body. Hobo, meaning a person who is homeless, who drifts. Originally the word came from soldiers returning home from war who were told, go home without giving the means to. And were actually instructed on how to jump rides on railroads and how to ask for people to help them to get home. Hobo, homeward bound is what that comes from. Hobo initially did not have the kind of negative connotations that it does today. In that a hobo now is seen as kind of a feckless drifter, a homeless person with no attachments, and oftentimes has these, again, connotations of being untrustworthy, not a part of society. The two combined, two words with modern negative connotations, kind of spells out something that is also going to be distinctly negative, and it is. There's no doubt about it. It's a negative term. If you are called a murder hobo, that means that your play style is one that cares nothing for an overarching narrative. You only care about what your players can deal with within their grasp without setting down any attachments, and your solution to all of your problems can be solved best by violence. Now, obviously, for a game master who enjoys running narratives, who believes that the game is oftentimes best served by just telling a meaningful story that the players get to contribute in, and guided by a game master, but ultimately it's a story that's shared by everyone. If that story is hack, kill, maim, murder, / kill, loot, kill, experience, grow, murder, A game master who has aspirations for hire is going to be disappointed if the murder hobo style of play is utilized by his players. And in my experience, one should almost, in an encounter with new players or players that are randomized because of the nature of conventions and things, should almost go into a game assuming that their players are going to have this outlook. It's difficult to place great attachment on a character you've just picked up or you just created as quickly as possible so that you can play in this game. By and large, it is an act of ongoing work to create the kind of bonds that a narrativist game master would like. They want their characters to be a bit of a part of the players. They want the characters to be important to the players and for the players to have a real and actualized mental image of what their characters would say, what they would do, so that they can be woven into the story and help build the story rather than just driving the plot and killing the bad guys. And obviously, this is a focus of many game mechanics in many games. For example, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons has a background system where you can give the player a definitive background and the game master can work those backgrounds into the plot to give the players bonds and things that are useful. Other parts of their background include things like bonds and ideals and all things to help try to rein in a player's desire to just run off the script and just start killing things and to not have bonds, to be able to drift from adventure to adventure to adventure. Now, the origins of murder hobo style gameplay come as far as role playing itself. In the early days, it is not unheard of for an entire campaign of gameplay to exist in nothing more than one module played after the other. The other option of play in the earliest days was one person to create a dungeon and the players to take turns diving into the dungeon and then going home and healing up and resting and what have you. That was almost a default mode of play. Obviously, there were people who were telling stories with the games at a very early time. But in as much as what was presented by the game companies, putting out their modules at the same time they put out their games, or putting out fantastic early magazines like The Dragon, or Pyramid, or any number of the Judges Guild and all their works, there was plenty of adventure on tap. You could be inspired by what was already out in print. And while there were some very good things out there, that kind of narrative, unless your game master did the work and came up with a story that would overarchingly bind those disparate modules together, well, what was a player to think? I'm going from point A to point B, possibly in completely different countries or townships, and having an adventure that oftentimes is me versus a bad guy, and solving the problem using all the combat skills that they have. This whole concept that we have come up with narrativist gameplay is a relatively new invention, and that, of course, it eclipses 90% of role-playing history, I'd say. But it is not the, it was not the default at certain times. Also helping that situation is the simple fact that some game masters prefer one-shots. Games, again, where you will throw a bunch of characters into a given scenario, and they aren't necessarily resolved in a single session, but they aren't meant to be part of an overarching story. Which, again, you don't really need a deep or rich character for, and probably wouldn't use that method as much for characters that are very involved and detailed. So again, oftentimes the murder hobo response to these kind of games comes out. Now, if you have players like these, there's several options, but quite honestly, in my opinion, most murder hobos are products of their environment. They learn these traits, they learn how to play, and they learn their win state by standing over the bodies of their foes because that's what's worked for them in the past. So as you can see, this behavior is mostly learned. For some people, the first time they pick open a game manual and start reading it, they see all the combat statistics and imagine their character doing crazy things and fighting. The roleplay comes later. It's more learned than anything. Oftentimes it can be difficult to get into a role because of social anxiety, fearing to be on the stage in front of other people, being afraid of being judged for how you do, and things like that. So the murder hobos are created, not born. But there's a good side to that. Behavior can be learned, good and bad. And I believe that the game master ultimately is in charge of his game, moderating it and making sure that the game is right for the players and the players are right for the game. So that leaves two approaches primarily to the murder hobo. Number one, you can beat them or you can join them. So, we'll go over the joining one first because it's simpler. Honestly, many murder hobo approach players are satisfied as long as there are good monsters to kill and plenty of treasure and steady advancement of their characters. That's what they want to see in their games. If you have at your heart a desire to tell a story, this is going to hurt a bit because you're going to have to trim off parts of your story that you wanted to tell and try to attach these parts to the character. You can still have an overweaving narrative that lays over the actions and things, but if your players all just want to kill things and take their money, then as a game master, to satisfy them, you may be able to do that. You may be able to, for instance, if you have this great story about treachery and betrayal and so on and so forth, you can have elements of that you narrate through rather than make the players have to engage with that. I wouldn't spend, the time crafting a great Veda of lore or, some epic ode. But again, let the players know that in the background things are happening, which you can easily do through narration, what people say around them or what they observe, but let the players then deal with the challenges that, fit their desires. It's one of the basic tacts of game mastering, especially a science that's necessary for playing with strangers. Just throw out an adventure and let the players take what they will out of it. Now, of course, you are going to have some circumstances where, you just really want some good role play and the players aren't going to give it to you because that style. Some people have to struggle with that. If you ever want that illustrated and narrated beautifully, the comic book Knights of the Dinner Table, created by Jolly Blackburn, is a classic example of a DM who has aspirations to tell a narrative story, and all the players just drag things down because they're not interested in buying the story, they want the loot, they want to kill the bad guys, end of the story. Which is, of course, amplified because those players have a foil in a fellow player, Sarah, who is a role player at heart and wants to try to steer the guys into more role play solutions, which sometimes works great and sometimes with hilarious consequences. So, that is the joining them part. Now, the beating them part is a little trickier. It requires a bit of patience on the part of the game master. But basically what you have to do is you have to illustrate in your game the advantages of being a part of the game. So, if you think about society in general, why do we follow the laws? Clearly, people who don't follow the laws sometimes win. They sometimes come out ahead. Sometimes people who are dishonest and who work the system and do things that we all consider morally repugnant sometimes are rewarded with wealth, positions of power, far above what we who just follow the laws and do our daily work ever achieve. And The problem with the murder hobo is they set that up as their example. However, I think most people would agree that the benefits of living in a society with mostly law-abiding people, the lack of anxiety by not worrying that you're going to have to be murdered when you walk out the street for your clothes or your money, is something of a relief. The ability to form attachments to people helps to defray the stresses and strains of life. And while there's always the dangers of forming attachments with other people, the benefits oftentimes far outweigh those disadvantages if they come due. We invest bits of ourselves into others and to others' structures, a job perhaps, a hobby, of course, and other things that you enjoy doing that make the day bearable. Because if it was all just stress, 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 and you can't form attachments that help to keep you, sane and going, it's a very grim life that you're probably going to lead. And with those kind of bonds and attachments, the players should see some sort of credible advantage to forming these bonds. A game master who heavily invests in a world should make it fairly clear that playing by the rules is advantageous to the players. One part of that is the carrot. Now, I oftentimes will encourage my players to have a backstory for their characters, as rich as they want to make it. I was one time handed a 10-page treatise from a player detailing their whole backstory, and it was fantastic. Sometimes they'll just dash off a few paragraphs, and even that is not terrible. As long as they remember the stuff in it and can stick to that or reference that from time to time, it's each player is going to have their own threshold for that. I find the best players for narrativist gameplay will want to flesh out and detail their character's background. It helps them because it helps them to focus on their character, get into their character's mindset, remember the things that were important or that happened to the character. But secondly, it helps communicate with the game master elements from that character's background that they can then incorporate into the world. And if you as a game master use those background points to tie in your players into the game, they're going to find those are rewards for the work that they did creating the character. So, if a character says in their background that they have 3 sisters, that they live in a swampy castle, their mom and dad were minor nobles, and their greatest export was peat, that sounds pretty boring, doesn't it? However, to me, it tells me one of those sisters is ripe to be kidnapped and, exploited over the player's head. The players will have an in on that black dragon that's pesky in the area. The local noble, mom and dad, will be more than willing to finance an expedition to go out and snuff it and take its treasure. And that at some point, mom and dad might just get too sick to go on. The daughters might be married off, and the party might inherit Swamp Keep, which could have its own set of advantages and some obligations that might tie the party down a little bit. In addition to that, that player is the child of a minor noble, which may inherit its own noble title, which may include obligations to a greater lord, or it may also have some advantages like, legal prestige, so that some crimes aren't held against you as strongly because you're a noble. But generally, I try to mix in as many good things as bad things. If that sister is going to be kidnapped, then perhaps the sister who marries well might marry a noble who can help the players out. Oh, my wife's brother, that's you? Well, I'll tell you what, if you do something for me, I can make this all go away, this whatever bad thing you stepped in. Those are bonds in a real world that are reinforcing good behavior that you want. You want players to tie in and come up with good backgrounds for the story. Make those pay from time to time. Did the character study at the heels of a master weaponsmith, for instance? And that's how they learned that part of the craft, and that master also told them how to fight, and that's how they became a great warrior? Well, maybe that master had his mastercraft item. He created a great sword, and he wants the players to come in and celebrate with him, and ultimately maybe he's even going to give it to his protege to carry on in his name. Number one, free awesome sword is great. Maybe he made it with some magical item that might make it magical. Who knows? But at the very least, there's a good excuse for a party. Great craft items were celebrated, or could be in your world, certainly. So they all show up to have a feast at the expense of this great master. Hey, it's a great time for a party. Great time for things to happen in story that can drive your ongoing plot and tie that player even more strongly into the plot. Now he's got the pride that he's associated with this great master. He's kind of a guest of honor because he brought the players to this. And, perhaps he gets something cool out of it. So that's the background element, and that's one of the most important parts in my mind of diffusing somebody from being a murder hobo, because you are forming these attachments and you're cutting down on the hobo part. You give them reasons to have a home, to have a home state that is worth protecting, has some significance to the character, so you're forming attachments, and perhaps may allow you to harken back to that to influence the player's activity, rather than just setting out another scenario in front of them, like a plate of meat to a group of hungry dogs. Instead, you are crafting something and delivering it to your players to enjoy and savor as they go through your story. Now, other things are other elements, in-game elements that you use to, reward good behavior. A lot of that is going to be encounter-based. What happens when the players actually get to something they can do? This will, of course, be the meat and potatoes of curbing the murder part of the murder hobo. If all of a party's actions are successfully accomplished through combat, then you're only reinforcing the behavior that you don't want. If you throw in encounters that can only be solved by non-combat, you're going to frustrate and alienate your players who are used to this kind of behavior. So, what you can do instead is have open-ended scenarios that can be solved any way the players want. If they solve them through acts of violence, there's a certain resolution. It's not a bad resolution, but it's not the best resolution either. If you show them that there are alternate ways to approach something, perhaps by observing somebody doing something else, or perhaps if one of the players takes a flyer out and tries something else, even if it's not a part of that storyline. Like, say, for instance, the group meets up with a pack of orcs. The orcs are at the head of a caravan. Orcs are not known to be great traders. The party comes across them. The large number of orcs may dissuade the party, who might not have the resources at this point of fighting all the orcs. If one of the players approaches, even though your book gives you a list of what's going to happen, and most of it negative, because they're going to see humans as raiders more so than anything, take charge of your story. Reward the players who step outside of the narrow bounds of view of the murder hobo approach. If they come up, the orc says, may say, greetings, friend. I have wares for you if you're interested. If you'd like to travel with us, we can travel in greater safety. And have a measured and reasonable approach that rewards players for stepping outside of those bounds. No, you don't have to put the game in easy mode. But you don't always have to roll dice meaningfully either. It's okay to pick up a handful of dice, roll them, and say, I was really blown away by your different approach to this. And show a credible and meaningful advantage to using other styles. Ultimately, when they've had some experience with that, you can throw in the combat is not an option approach, and the players may get that. But if you throw that in right away, your players are going to resent that. For example, the unkillable enemy. Commonly, I've seen that used to try to bludgeon murder hobos over the head with, and it rarely works well. The players will either grind themselves to a stump and all die trying to fight this unkillable foe, or they'll run, but they'll really resent that. Ultimately, the players should resent that to some extent, giving them more of a want to overcome this opponent. But it often smacks of being railroady and plot hammerish. So that's a kind of positive reinforcement that oftentimes works. The last thing that I would recommend, and it's generally a good one, is giving the players in story things and reasons to care about. And this is a little bit different from crafting encounters and modifying encounters to reward players. If you give the players something of value, they have an instinctive urge to want to protect it. If that something is a person who is trying to engage them, or something, that can talk, maybe an intelligent sword or some such, and that thing expresses a certain amount of vulnerability, you may, depending on the group, depending on how committed they are to this position, they may start to try to think outside of what is convenient for their character and create bonds themselves. For example, say the party's a group of warriors. They've been fighting barbaric goblins and gnolls. The group comes across a cleric who is not able to fight well. This cleric clearly wants to help out, but can't help out in the way the party does. We're all optimized for combat and killing and things. The group sees an advantage in having a healer around. It makes sense. So, have the group adopt the cleric, even if the cleric would normally be morally repugnant of the way this group behaves. Maybe the cleric every once in a while will chime in. Like, perhaps that isn't the way that would have been best. The players, over time, as long as you don't get too, pernicious about it, don't throw it in their faces all the time, perhaps the group may occasionally, kind of linger and listen a little bit. This is the moral compass character, and they're not used very often anymore. They were used as kind of an artificial narrator to try to drive the characters one way or the other, but I found that given enough utility coupled with vulnerability, these characters can be quite useful. It's kind of like an encounter that you seed in through the game that suggests without being overpowering. Quite honestly, there is a little bit of the stick element to it too. If the party continues in their bad ways, you can take that character away. Perhaps it might have an impact. All the things that we've talked about so far is the carrot end of the carrot and the stick approach. Now comes the stick. Murder hoboing has no real credible approach in any civilized society. Society exists so that you put value in things and that you don't kill people. Obviously, there are some outlandish elements that do. We know of societies that are brutal. We do know of people who perhaps have cut off all ties and choose to drift. And generally, they are the exception. In our society, we do have means to curb that approach to life. And generally, they're ingrained on almost everybody. Number one, that would be accomplished with a background. If you don't have any kind of a background, then you're basically an amnesiac. You don't have anything around you that attaches to you. That's kind of anathema to social creatures, which humans and elves and dwarves and whatnot generally are. In some games, there may be races that have less approach to community, or maybe they're inherently outside of many of the communities, but that doesn't mean that they aren't surrounded by social people and could have some sort of lingering desire for that kind of companionship and such. But if you don't have anything to attach you, then society itself is going to look at you as an outsider And that may have its own share of problems. Traders who are a little less willing to deal with you because you're a strange, not just a stranger, but you're a strange person. And you want to buy all these weapons? Maybe you want to know about, these. There are going to be some structures that might work for you. For example, guilds. If you could join anonymously and be a part of, that's an artificial social construct. But in general, these kind of players aren't going to want to attach themselves to groups. They just cause trouble. They just pull your strings. So, requiring or causing a negative situation because the players aren't gilded, for instance, it's not unseemly for example, if you're talking about a fantasy medieval society, requiring anybody who buys a weapon bigger than a dagger be part of the local adventuring guild or a mercenary company. Having a reason to arm yourselves, number one, for the nobility, stops a peasant uprising. If you know the people who are going to try to kill you, at least then you can isolate them and know what they are capable of. And if you are the adventurers or you are the mercenaries, you are holding yourselves up as kind of elite fighters. If you have a monopoly on being able to buy weapons and such, you have a lot of say over what the common peasantry has and can lord it over them. So that is a reasonable approach to, formatting your society, which is on the game master to do. Otherwise, as well, some of the other nice things that a person can buy or have a utility for may require membership in a particular guild or a religious organization or some such. Restricting the access of things like healing potions. If you want those to strictly be what can be created in a temple, eschewing wizards or alchemists or others could create healing potions if you say they can only be created by holy and divine magic and such. Well, if you're not part of the Brotherhood, then you're just going to have to find whatever healing potions because we don't sell to the unbelievers or the heathens. Forming attachments. By withholding things that the players may deem to be essential or useful, that's the stick approach. Another stick approach is, and this is the big one, honestly. Again, I've never had any great problem with Murderhoboes in my games. I'll be completely honest with you, and this is the reason I credit strongest. My world has consequences. A good, self-realized world that the Game Master has fully come to terms with and grasp with, there are consequences to killing people. If you get into a bar fight, you whip out a weapon and you dice that person who was not going to kill you because it's illegal to kill. Maybe you're in a society where just a dust-up is swept under the rug. Maybe a night in prison and a couple silvers for a fine or something like that. Not like today where, you deck somebody in the eye, you could be liable for, a doctor's visit and, a week in jail for, it's a messier time now. But back in the day, such things weren't that uncommon. The nobility didn't mind if the peasants beat themselves up a bit, as long as they didn't kill anybody and rob the nobles of their just due and labor, because it helped them to blow off steam. As long as they were fighting amongst themselves, they weren't pointing the pitchforks at the nobles. So if your world has, a reasoned approach and a consistent set of rules and social structures, the very actions that the players, if they are committed to being these murder hobos that narrative game masters hate so much, then those characters are going to run afoul of the law pretty quickly. You can't just kill things to get through situations that may be unpleasant or difficult. Maybe if it's because your character is so statted out for combat that you can't walk across the street without help or put on your pants without help, then there's consequences to that. If you draw a weapon every time your character is inconvenienced, if somebody, takes a swing at you with a fist that at worst could knock you out, and you kill that person, you've murdered them. You can't claim self-defense the same way. And unless there's some significant outward reason why that was justified. And the character was a monk, for instance, and the fists were dangerous. Very few law enforcement persons are going to have a lot of sympathy for, you know, going through and killing someone, especially if you couldn't kill them in one blow. It took several blows to kill that person. You have shown a commitment to murdering that person. That's going to mean lengthy jail stay. It may, in extreme situations, involve the execution of the character involved. That is the ultimate stick, the world making sense around the players. And as a form of behavioral deterrence, if the players have to think, if I'm going to commit a crime, I have to figure out a way to get around it, at least then they're thinking of other means or other responses. If their only response is, oh, I killed the bartender. No, you're going to jail and are probably going to get hung. Oh, that's bogus. No, you killed somebody. That's illegal. There are people there to protect other people from people like you. Then maybe the players will start considering, maybe I shouldn't do this. Especially if, in your session 0, the very first session of a game, when you're just making out the characters and explaining your world and concept, you tell them, actions have a real consequence here. Your characters are going to be held up against the law. There is no free pass because you're adventurers. Even if you become heroes, you can't just randomly start killing people. As long as they're fairly warned, as a game master, you're pretty well covered. Now, it doesn't mean you'll be covered in the estimations of the players. If the players suffer the consequences of their actions, either facing prejudice because they are shiftless and have no tethers or bonds in the society, or if it's because they try to resolve all of their actions with extreme violence, well, the players may become disgruntled. They may leave. If that's the case, they weren't ever really going to fit into your narrative. That is sometimes the sad case. You will occasionally find those players who are impossible to bring into your group and have them be a happy and productive member of the group. If you're fortunate and you have other players who are, this person will stick out like a sore thumb and will probably face some heat from their fellow players because they are closing off windows that those players want to explore. And generally you're going to have an unhappy group if you have a mix of role players and these murder hobos. On the other hand, they're going to be unhappy with you as a game master because you're not giving them the challenges they want, something that can be solved by combat and they can get the treasure and move on. Either way, the separation shouldn't be too painful. If you make it clear that this is the way that you are running a game, they are not going to want to be part of that game if that is how you're going to run the game. And the separation should happen. Now that can flip. A disgruntled player may not always just want to leave. Sometimes they may want to leave as much chaos behind as possible and become trollish. Well, as a game master, whenever that happens, you have your responsibility to keep your gaming group intact and eliminate such players. It's just what we have to do. If somebody is ruining the fun of other players by selfish behavior, you do what you have to do. This is responsibility as old as being a referee or a dungeon master, a game master back in the day. And oftentimes you will find that when that happens, when you have that kind of separation, there's oftentimes a shock where people find themselves getting more comfortable quickly and get more invested in the game. I'm not saying put up a sacrificial murder hobo in your group, get rid of them, try to beef up your game. I'm just saying you'll find that with all those pressures suddenly gone, you can spend that effort that you spent butting heads and reinvesting that into your game. However, I, in my experience, have found that those players are, number one, becoming less and less. More narrative games and the way that more people are being exposed to gameplay, they're realizing that it's not just about rolling dice and killing monsters. More people are being attracted because of the stories that we can tell, or they're being attracted to particular intellectual properties that demonstrate actions that aren't strictly about shooting. If you love Star Wars, then you know that it's not all just about shooting stormtroopers. It's also about sometimes a budding romance or a bromance between Han and Lando, or uh, it's about adventure and exploration and seeing new things and learning new things. And people who love an IP and come to a role playing game oftentimes come for that environment. But in case of a lot of other narrative style games, they come because of the narrative, or something involving the story, like Vampire the Masquerade's dark romance with the politics and the bonds and the personal tragedy. So that is my approach, and it's been a pretty successful one over the years, I must say, to dealing with Murderhoboes. I hope that this may fire your imagination on ways if you are confronted with players who are animically against the approach you like to use in your games, to either alter their behavior, or realize that your own style can use a little trimming too. So, thank you for listening to this rather exhaustive treatise on the topic. I think you feel that you probably earned some treasure, haven't you? Well, here goes. Looking around my lair, almost everywhere you look, there is stuff everywhere. I'm not bragging about how much I have. This isn't all prime, loot. These aren't things that are worth thousands of dollars. They're game books from a wide variety of time periods, many of which have been loved to the point where they're kind of falling apart. But one thing that many of them have in common, almost everything in my collection, is that I didn't pay full price for almost any of it. I am a person who is a sucker for a good deal. But as a result, I rarely pay full price for anything. So much of what I have has been within my means. I haven't bankrupted myself collecting all of this stuff. And when you get to be a game master, especially if you have your own home, it can be very, very easy to collect whatever you think of that might help your game. The good news is that since our hobby is 40 plus years old, there's been a lot of stuff that's been out throughout the ages, and not all of it has been as well received or as loved. And opportunities may arise for you to get useful treasures that you can use in your games. I'll show you just a couple of examples. For instance, this knight statuette is from the Schleich collection. German, beautiful detail on the charger. The armor is historical, the target shield, the lance, and everything. And there's a companion knight to go with it. My wife got it for me, and she paid too much. But it's very nice. On the other hand, and yes, this fits into a diorama of sorts for decoration for down here. But I found this, which is not made by Schleich. It is another company that produces figures. But I was at a big box retailer. I was not looking for gaming materials, but I was walking around the markdown section, and I saw this guy. And he's kind of a little bit of a derpy Hydra. He's his eyes, I think, he's got the little dots for eyes, which kind of bother me a little bit. But he's got decent mass, and as far as scaling goes, here's a dwarf. He's a large-sized Hydra, possibly a touch bigger than the Dungeons and Dragons model, but I've never complained about having a figure that's a bit bigger.
And he poses quite the menace for a five-headed Hydra in action chomping mode. And I think I paid $5 for this. And it caught me completely by surprise. I was walking through the clearance toy section and boom. And I knew I had to have it. So I showed it to my wife and she's like, oh yeah, you should get that. It's cheap. And it looks pretty cool. I, of course, if this doesn't fit the particular style of the Hydra, a little paint, maybe a little green putty here and there, fixing up a few of the defects or changing it the way I want. I could give them spikes if I want, or make them a touch scalier, or change his color scheme. And I wasn't out much. I mean, if I went to get a figure like this as a blank figure for gaming, it wouldn't be this durable plastic, for one thing. It would be a bit more brittle, not as flexible. And it would probably, for something this size, set me back about $20 for a Reaper Bones figure of about this size, I think. It would require me gluing several points, which again creates a little brittleness. It drops. All of a sudden your Hydra only has 3 heads, for instance. So this is just, as you are going with the gamer mindset of getting some of these things for your game, opportunities will come. It just involves opening yourself up to the opportunities. Another thing, you've heard of the game Mage Knight, perhaps? It was a miniatures game, and the characters were all on these special discs that could click and show their stats decreasing as they got wounded. And it kept track of all the stats on the base, so you didn't have to have a list of all of your units. You could see right on the map. Well, the larger scale war games, in at least where I'm at, never really caught on as much as some of the more popular ones like Warhammer. Matter of fact, I think Warhammer is kind of the juggernaut of these kind of games that has driven out most of the others. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. And they did make several things that came through. So for another example, there's this Dwarven battle tank. It's a steam-driven thing. It's got the steam boiler on the back. It's got this rotating, huge, ridiculous cannon. It's got the very, very, very spiky doom roller in the front. And I can use this piece for any number of things. I've used this as a Blood Bowl piece for the Dwarven Doom Roller. Although only in represent the actual their one is actually a bit smaller, obviously, but something very much like that. It's been for dwarves, but it's also been a goblin contraption once or twice for different games. It also looks nice. It is a good decoration in my miniature section of my lair, but it is again something I think I paid $12 for this. As far as the actual game goes, it's got 4 clickable panels, so it can be effective in 4 different directions. And this big cannon, I'm sure, can put the hurt on figures if you're playing the large-scale battle of Mage Knight, which I've never played. I cannibalize everything I get from Mage Knight for role-playing. Honestly, a piece like this is so much cheaper than if I got something that was made of pewter or was made of plastic for role-playing purposes. This is yet another avenue that I've saved a lot of money getting some really nice figures, pre-painted, durable plastic, that work just fine for miniatures. My players don't have to imagine as much. So that is, I know I've mentioned that thrift is a fine thing when you're a game master. Your hobby is possibly going to cost you some money. Let's face it, depending on what you have to have. But finding deals and bargains like that in places that you normally wouldn't look. If you're a regular role player, maybe you don't look at the war game so much. But there could be fantastic values if you know where to look. I don't hit sites like eBay and things up that often. But when I go to my favorite local store and I see they're having a closeout on a line that's collapsed, it's a good time to pick up some specials. So that's what I like to do. So at any rate, for being here, I just happen to have this fine, slightly derpy looking Hydra. There's a secret to this Hydra, though. You know what? I'll let you figure it out. Tell you what, you can have this Hydra. Mark it on your character sheet. If you come play with me sometime, just let me know that you've got the Hydra from episode 22. And then we'll figure out what it does together. Well, I know, but you'll find out and might save your bacon. So, this has been fun. I missed this quite a bit. And I am, as ever, your Game Master OmnusI. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you look forward to my next offering. As always, feel free to like and subscribe. Share with your friends if you wish. Save it for some piece when somebody is bringing up Murderhoboes, and you can just be like, this guy's got it figured out. Might move you up in people's estimations. But, as always, if you have other ideas for me or questions or problems that you've had, send me a comment, and I will respond to it in kind at some point. I'm OmnusI. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that all of your future ventures are successful and safe. Farewell.